Bill Goff is in China. I am the acting dean, so I have the honor of welcoming you here today for this talk series. I'm here to introduce the third speaker in our Great Exploration seminar season. And for those of you who are regulars to this seminar series and discussion, you'll notice that we have a fuller than usual house today. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, we're really pleased to welcome about the 20 guests who've joined us from Senior College. These are retired faculty, librarians, and senior administrations from the University of Toronto. All retirees in these categories are automatically members of Senior College, and this includes retirees from all three campuses. Senior College provides a number of opportunities for continued involvement with the U of T community, and we have information about them in the screens outside and also some handouts in case you want to learn more if you're in one of those categories and want to join Senior College. To welcome Senior College to UTSC, we've arranged to have everyone who registered for this talk join us today for a complimentary lunch. So if you're available after the seminar for lunch and you registered for the talk, please do pick up a lunch ticket on your way out of the room and we'll show you to the room where lunch will be available. Special bonus from the dean's office. There will be a tour immediately after lunch in which we're going to take a look at some of the newer spaces on campus, and that's led usually by undergraduate students. It's a great opportunity to take in more of the campus than you see when you just come to this room and go in your car or the bus and go home. So everyone's welcome to that as well. That starts about 1:15. Now the second reason why this room is full is that clearly the word is getting out that about this seminar series. We've seen a steady increase in attendance, and it's really given us a great time and chance to connect to the community. Have people bring their ideas in as well as us pushing ideas out, and to engage in dialogue about themes that are relevant to all of us. And along those lines, if you do fill out an evaluation form at the end and suggest themes for the future, the group that organizes this is always looking for new themes that resonate with the community. Now the third reason this room is so full, of course, is today's speaker, William Wolfe-Wylie. And I love the alliterative name. That's not the only reason we're here, it's a great name. A reporter, editor, columnist, and software developer across 3 of Canada's national media organizations, William Wolfe-Wylie is taught at the University of Toronto, Ryerson University, Centennial College, the Ladies Learning Code, love that one, and University of King's College. When he's not in front of the classroom, he's usually writing code to support investigations and tell stories at CBC News, where he's currently a senior developer in News Interactives, and where he helped to launch CBC's data journalism project. Today he's going to be talking to us about being a critical consumer of news in the age of data journalism. I was really intrigued by his talk description, I think all of you were too, which concluded with a promise that's critical today. We looked at what media literacy means in the age of data journalism, how journalists can get it wrong, and how you can spot it when they do. Clearly a critical skill today, and I look very much for a discussion after his talk. His talk is entitled Critical News Consumption in the Age of Data Journalism. Please join me in welcoming William Wolfe-Wylie.
Thank you. Turning on teacher voice. Is everything clear in the back row? If there's any difficulty hearing at all, or do we need to turn up the mic? Turn up a little bit? All right, we can turn, yeah. Got myself mic'd up here just in case. So, basically, I've been working in internet news since about 2007, which is around when students started bringing laptops to class and most professors started freaking out because handwritten notes started looking worse than ever. Since then, I've sort of like shifted away from the print side of life and into the internet side of life. And despite being a BA in history and English, really started gravitating more towards the mathematical, the computational side of news. So today what I want to do is go through a few of the really big data-driven stories that we've published this year at CBC, talk about where the data came from, talk about how it's less robust than we would have liked, and talk about how the average consumer of news needs to be more aware of where this actually comes from. Huzzah for clarity. So, so just to recap, as I was saying, what I want to do today is go through 3, 4, maybe 5, depending on time, of the major data-driven projects that we've launched at CBC this year, look at the data that feeds into those projects, how some of them may not initially look like data-driven projects, and talk about the critical eye that we can bring to them to poke holes in them and to discuss how the data behind them is not necessarily as robust as we would like. Especially in a room of academics, I think the source of data and our methodologies are going to be really, really fun for everybody. So about a year ago, my wife and I discovered that we were going to have a baby. And we're very, very happy about that. And because we were both nerds, she actually does very much the same job I do, but she does it at the Globe and Mail. I do it at the CBC. Makes for a very, very nerdy nighttime conversation. And we started making a lot of spreadsheets. There were spreadsheets for the books we needed to read, spreadsheets for the stuff we needed to buy, spreadsheets for the stuff we had already bought, spreadsheets for budgeting and all, how it was going to break down, and then master spreadsheets that read from those other spreadsheets to talk about what we'd already done from the stuff we needed to do. Very, very, very nerdy parents here. That continued after our child arrived. We started logging everything that we possibly could. There were little spreadsheets for when he fed, when he went number 1, when he went number 2, when we were up, when he went to sleep. We only actually managed to do that for about 4 weeks before we said, this is insane, we're not going to do this anymore. But it made for an interesting moment because one of my best friends who now lives in Ottawa, he texted me one day and he said, how's parent life going? And I just took a screen capture of the spreadsheet of his activities and sent it to him. And he just had to look down the row of timestamps and said, 9:02 p.m., 10:35 p.m., 11:45 p.m., 12:15 a.m., 1:30 a.m., 3:30 a.m., 5:15 a.m. And he goes, oh yeah, so you're not coming out for beers this weekend then? Because it didn't really matter what was beside each of those lines. It didn't really matter what he did at those times. It just mattered that I was awake at those times, logging something in the spreadsheet, because our little baby was doing something at those times. That was a data-driven story. One row of data is all it took to drive a little story home. But it was a perspective. It was a little niche piece of data. It was a perspective of data. It was a way of wrapping our heads around the data. It didn't talk about the volume of his cries. It didn't talk about whether I was hallucinating when I woke up at night because it was, the 4th time in a row of 90 minutes of sleep at a time. It didn't talk about how hungry I was. It didn't talk about how hungry he was or how much he fed. It didn't actually tell you a lot of the details that you would expect a data-driven or spreadsheet-driven approach to talk about. And it became a bit of an interesting perspective because we can use that idea of the missing data or the perspective of data to tell stories, to then approach a lot of the other journalism that we do to tell stories in the broader world with spreadsheets as inspiration and as source for those pieces of work. Now, this is really not a new idea. The idea of data-driven journalism or data journalism or computational journalism, it goes by a number of terms these days, not a new idea at all. The idea that we can look at a giant log and start to tell stories about it, to ask questions of it, is really, really old. People have loved doing this for a really long time. Here's a great piece from the New York Tribune in 1848. One member of Congress in the United States decided, this Abraham Lincoln guy seems sketchy. He keeps claiming these mileage expenses for his travels around. I don't know, it seems high to me. So he went through the entire House of Representatives, looked at their miles traveled, looked how much they billed the House for reimbursements, and wrote a story about it and said, Abraham Lincoln keeps billing us way more than anybody else does. Investigative data-driven reporting. More than a century and a half ago. The stories that we tell have changed. The technology we use to tell them have changed. But the whole idea that we can take public records, or take records that we want to be public, and use them to describe the world around us, to give people a broader perspective on the world they live in, the people governing them, and the companies serving them, has evolved quite a bit. So this was a piece from this winter and summer and fall. A relatively broad piece. This is your standard Ticketmaster website. This is a band called Panic at the Disco. Their Pray for the Wicked tour is very, very popular. They are expected to sell out. I personally don't know this band. But we started seeing some tips coming from a number of people asking, well, how does the resale market work? We all know that scalpers are a thing. Scalpers have been a thing in the ticketing world for a really long time. Whether it was paying people to line up at the ticket booth for a big concert in the 50s, or whether it's writing computer programs that spam these services with fake credit cards to buy up tickets in advance. So we started asking ourselves, if we wanted to learn as much as we could about how one event sells, how much could we learn? Well, turns out we can learn quite a bit. Because if you zoom in on this, you can see every single seat for sale. Now these are the primary tickets of Ticketmaster is currently listing for sale on this service. There aren't very many left. But if you were to come back to this site 30 seconds from now, you might notice a couple missing. 30 seconds later, you might notice a couple more missing. 30 seconds later, you might notice a couple more coming back. And by poking away at it every 30 seconds or so, for an extended period of time, like say 10 months or so, you can develop an interesting perspective on how tickets are moving out of this event and how they're being listed for sale. So this is, we'll make that a little bit bigger. This is the stadium map for the Bruno Mars tour at the Air Canada Centre. Sorry, they've changed their name since then. For Scotiabank Arena. 1 minute after they went on sale to the general public. So this is a little bit faded out here, but we have a stage right here, and we have your standard stadium that wraps all the way around. Floor seats in the middle, and then we have a bunch of seats that go up the upper deck around the side there. This is what the sale map looks like 1 minute after they went on sale to the general public. And you start to see some patterns. None of the middle floor seats are for sale. We got a couple on the aisles, nothing in the middle of the floor is for sale yet. Those are being held back. You can't quite see it here, but the back half, the front half of these seats actually come down this far. None of these front seats are for sale yet. Same with the back half of these ones. None of those are for sale yet. And there are actually sections here, and that's across the top, that also aren't for sale yet. A few hours later, we can see the colors change as the resale market kicks in. All the red tickets, which were for sale by Ticketmaster, have started to disappear, and the resale market, the scalpers, have started to kick in and sell their tickets at elevated prices. We also know that Ticketmaster has started to release the middle seats on the floor, and these side sections behind are now listed for sale. The idea was that we could map how an individual seat moves from Ticketmaster listing it for sale and you as a concert goer saying, I'm sitting in that seat watching the event. How many vendors does it go through? How many times does the price change? Can you predict that pattern? Can you then, hypothetically speaking, answer questions from family in Vancouver who really want tickets to the Elton John show when it might be a good time to buy those tickets? Hypothetically speaking. Could you talk about how these strategies can be used to inflate prices? Well, it turns out, sure. Any Leafs fans in the house? Not that crowd. This is the Leafs, if you didn't know, they made the playoffs last year. They might this year. It's looking good so far. This is a map of the Leafs arena for the first home playoff game in Toronto in 8 years. The seats highlighted in red are the seats that were made available for sale to the general public across the entire sale period in advance of the game. From, you can buy seats, get to the Leafs game now, up to puck drop. That's how many seats were available for the general public to purchase. Up to 80% of that arena is controlled by season ticket holders. and they were going to that game. So we can actually answer these questions. It becomes an interesting piece. And then we can take that back to Ticketmaster. We can take it to the executives at StubHub. We can go to the managers of the Leafs. We can go to the managers for Bruno Mars. We can go to the managers of the Jays. And we can say, okay, we're noticing patterns here. What does this look like to you? And this is when I'm running classes on this for journalism schools. I call this interviewing the data. Because just splashing the data on a screen can be fun, but it's very rarely actually an act of journalism. What we do is we interview the data to ask questions of it, to dive into it, to allow it to lead our curious brains and to say, what doesn't make sense? What looks weird about this? What patterns can we derive from this? And in this case, we found some interesting stuff because, yes, we can actually kind of predict when prices will fall for major events. We can predict, based on the activity of the resale market, when an event is high demand versus low demand. And that can actually be an interesting thing. And these companies are actually using that to dictate what ticket prices will be. And more of them are starting to engage in dynamic ticket pricing, where depending on how many people arrive on their site, search for this event, they'll change the price of the ticket. 50,000 people just came and searched for the Jays game. That seems like a high demand event. There's only 50,000 seats in the stadium. Cool, well, let's just jack up those prices by like $5 a seat, see what happens next. Ticketmaster calls this their platinum pricing program. So this is sort of what a relatively involved investigative story looks like at CBC. Starts with a question, moves through a, well, what data could we collect about this in the first place? Through a long and large data collection process where we just look at how much we can learn, and then we start interviewing and asking questions. We lock ourselves in a boardroom and we start pouring through spreadsheets for about a week. And then we bring the questions back to the executives of these companies so that they can answer for them. And then we write a series of stories. I think this turned into about 8 stories overall. And we're still getting tips from the general public, tips from the scalpers who have seen these programs and have behind the scenes access. So you can actually see more of this coming out over the next few weeks. On the other hand is an entirely different set of data. Geographers in the room? No. Oh, geography nerdery is a special degree of nerdery. Those people like to go deep. Which is probably good because they won't actually be able to call me on this because I'm going to screw something up in here, I bet. Geospatial data is a whole lot of fun. Sometimes a data story is a big investigative piece where we get to look at what is going on behind the scenes of a company or a government. And sometimes we just want to make something cool. 2 years ago, we were approached about building something for the 100th anniversary of the Halifax explosion. Largest military disaster in Canadian history, largest man-made explosion before Hiroshima. Flattened the city. And 100 years later, how do we tell that story? How do we talk about what it means to that city, what it meant to that city? Well, you put a bunch of journalist programmers in a room and tell them to be ambitious, they come up with some crazy ideas. So we had the idea that what if we actually rebuilt Halifax Harbor? What if we rebuilt every building in 1917 Halifax as it existed in that moment and then blew it up? Well, it turns out that there's data for that. The Government of Canada has Landsat data, satellite radars that actually have meter-by-meter accuracy to create a digital elevation model of the entire country. All you have to do is decide which part of the country you want to look at, and you can actually get the data that describes how the landmass looks at that point. So you can just find a location, or you can click your area on a map and see what's up. That results in, well, nothing very exciting looking. This is a top-down view of Halifax Harbor. We have a little bit of this is the Narrows right here. It's very shallow right there. So the Landsat data actually penetrated the water and picked up land underneath. But up towards the top, you have the ocean, and then you have the basin in there, which is a really, really lovely deep water protected harbor, which is why it was one of the main fronts for the war machine in Canada. Most war resources left from Halifax. Right at the end of the railroad, nice protected deepwater harbor, perfect spot. Until, right where that red dot is, there was a really big boom. Turn it into a digital wireframe. We get Citadel Hill, big military lookout. We got a little island in the middle, lots of flat water. And we can start to rebuild the actual harbor. Add some terrain to it, add a little fog effect, add a little sky effect, and all of a sudden we have a decent little representation of what it looks like from Citadel Hill looking back towards the basin before any buildings got in the way. Now, one of the fun things about a military disaster is insurance companies get in the mix. You flatten most of a city, people kind of want you to pay to rebuild it. So, we have an insurance map. Where the Canadian government actually took a little pen and outlined in blue for the completely flattened buildings, in red for the ones that burned to the ground, in yellow for the ones that were severely damaged and would need to be torn down later. And every single building in the city is accounted for in this map from 1918 provided by the Canadian Armed Forces. So what we did is we took that and overlaid it on top of our own map to create this lovely interactive piece where we can say, we can overlay each piece and then actually zoom in on the city itself and fly around it. Tell some stories about it. And so there is the city of Halifax as it existed, building for building, in 1917. Buildings are color-coded for the level of damage sustained during the explosion. This is a data-driven story project. But the data is not trying to lead into an investigation. The data is not trying to hold government to account. The data is just trying to bring you there, to show you what it felt like when a bomb went off, with some archival photos. Random aside, this is the first fire engine to ever be purchased by the Halifax Fire Department. The bottom half of that steering wheel came off in the driver's hands. He woke up about a half a mile away still holding it. There's what it looked like after the explosion. Notice half the steering wheel missing. Now I'm just going to close that because running 3D models on this really, really old laptop takes up a pile of battery power. And then there comes the government pieces. Now, governments like to talk a really big game about how transparent they are, about how they want you to understand the work that we do, until it comes time to play ball, in which case they usually say, yeah, you know, it's really important to us. We're going to get back to you. It's gotta go. So after the Wetlaufer murders and trial, where she was found guilty of murdering several people in long-term care, we started looking at, well, what's the state of long-term care homes in Ontario? Surely a murderer operating for the better part of a decade in a long-term care home is a sign that something is off. What is off? Is that the tip of the iceberg, or was that really the one bad apple? What's that look like? So we called the provincial government and said, can you give us every inspection report for every inspection at a long-term care home that's been performed by a provincial inspector? Give us every single one of them. They said, yeah, it's on our website. Go knock yourselves out. So this is the website they pointed us to, where you can say, oh yeah, there's a link right there for long-term care home inspection reports. Oh, so you can find them on a map, find them by postal code, find by location, find by home name. That seems okay, except for it's not data. Looking at one inspection report for one home, that's called anecdote. And there are, we counted them, just north of 18,000 reports on this website. So to get data, I'm going to have to either hire a pile of interns and get them all to read inspection reports all day and make notes and spreadsheets, which, if you ever worked with 22-year-olds who have to read inspection reports all day, I'll give you one guess how accurate that data turns out on the other end. Or you can say, not good enough. I need the summary data. I need to know every single time each home was inspected, what they found on each side, and I need to know the dates, and I need to know the specific code violations, and I need to know the frequency of the inspections, and I need to know the dates when the initial report came in, and then the date the actual inspection came in, because that's one of the big problems that we kept hearing from staff at these homes, is they would complain to the province, and then a year and a half later, an inspector would show up. And they'd be like, yeah, the residents we were talking about aren't here anymore. So don't know what you want to inspect, but this is what one of those inspection reports looks like. Anyone in this room ever try and grab data from a PDF? That's a fun game. 18,000 of these. Variable page length. This one's 23 pages long. Some of them are image PDFs that have been scanned in. Some of them are printed PDFs. And as provincial governments change over the years, formats sort of shift a little bit. So from there, this was a project that's actually ongoing right now from Marketplace in the 5th Estate. They come to our team and say, okay, I've got a website that's got long-term care inspection reports on it. Help? So what we came up with was a good little system where we can say, okay, take each of them, separate them out into their component pages, and then run optical character recognition on them so that we can turn each page into just a text file. So step one. Now we have actually a little piece where we can highlight things. And then we have reporters come up with a specific list of code violations, which the government will actually give you. How many different ways can a long-term care home break the law? Oh, well, let me tell you. Turns out there's about 150 of them. Specific code violations that you can break as the operator of a long-term care home. They all come in a format kind of like this. The Long-Term Care Homes Act, 2007, Section 8, Chapter 8, Section 6. And from that, now we can actually run an analysis on the text files and turn that around into, well, I found this pattern, a citation of the Long-Term Care Home Act, Chapter 8, Subsection 8, Paragraph 6, on page 23 of this inspection report. This inspection report was performed on this long-term care home on this date, and you can slowly build out a spreadsheet. That spreadsheet turned out to be, wasn't terribly huge. I think it was about 25,000 rows long. And from that, we can run some queries, run some pivot tables on them, and turn it into a story. This was the first Marketplace story that went out last year. Valerie Ouellette is one of our senior data reporters. She's one of the best database minds that the CBC has right now, so I collaborate with her on a lot of these projects. And we slowly get the ability to report which long-term care homes in Ontario are actually problematic. Which ones might have a keyword of a report that stood out in our anecdote because we happened to click on that one first. This one didn't have enough nurses on the floor at that one time. Or which ones didn't have enough nurses on the floor and then the next year didn't have enough medical supplies in their cabinets. And then the next year had problems with their heating systems, and the next year someone died. And we can map those progressions. And my favorite example comes from private enterprise. especially private enterprise in the tech sector. There is a certain, I'm going to get in trouble for using the word, but there's a certain level of arrogance that comes with tech entrepreneurs right now, because they are the billionaires of Silicon Valley. Toronto is adding actually more tech jobs than Silicon Valley is right now. Pile of reasons for that, but Toronto is now Canada's Silicon Valley. And there aren't very many regulations to actually manage what they do. The modus operandi for Uber, for Airbnb, for Lyft, for all of these services is, we'll just start doing business in this town, and if you choose to regulate us later, maybe we'll make it a ballot box issue. You can fight us then when you figure out what it is that we're actually doing. And we start looking at that kind of thing, because these are large companies that are dealing with our property, our safety, our transportation infrastructure, and they have access to our phones. They have access to our computers. Sometimes that's a great thing. Sometimes it's a little bit shady. So this was a piece that we actually ended up writing policy about at CBC, because we can't just go tapping into these organizations and extracting data from them willy-nilly. That's called hacking. That's when the RCMP show up at your door and they're not very pleased. But when we're operating in the public interest, we can take a look at a site like this and say, well, what are they displaying? What are they showing us? And if we have concern, if we have reason to behave in the public interest, can we just sort of gather some of that data ourselves? So Airbnb is a global force. They are the world's largest hotel chain. They do billions in sales every year. Depending on which city you look at, some people accuse them of driving up property values. Because people buy investment properties, they rent them out on Airbnb, and now that property is no longer available for the long-term rental market. So if there's fewer properties available on the long-term rental market, rents go up. Oh, rents are more profitable now? Cool. More people are buying investment properties. Oh yeah, but it's actually more profitable to put them on the short-term rental market than the long-term rental market. Okay, we'll do that. Oh, fewer properties on the long-term rental market, rents just went up. And more municipalities are pointing to Airbnb as a reason for that when they're operating in an unregulated environment. Now, the data doesn't necessarily support that big of an issue. New York City did a big data investigation into whether or not that's happening in New York. They found that Airbnb was responsible for about 6, 7, maybe 8% of the property, of the rent increases, and renting had gone up by like 80% in that city. So some of it's due to short-term rentals, a lot of it's due to other forces. But we can take a look at what they're doing in our cities instead of relying on other cities to do the work for us for them. This is Airbnb after we mined a little bit of their data. And one of the things that I was trying to look at was, who are the bigger operators? I mean, Airbnb bills itself as, you can rent out your spare room. Got a basement apartment under your house? Cool, rent it out while you're out of town for the weekend. Rent out your space. That's the marketing language that Airbnb uses. But there's a subsection of people who are super hosts in Airbnb's language, who are property managers who operate more than one property, who may operate a dozen properties. In my research, people who have operated 70 properties in the city. They are large-scale property managers. There is one company in Whistler that operates more than 150 different properties on Airbnb in Whistler. Whistler's not a big space. They are a big player in the property game there. This is a map of where people are operating more than 5 Airbnb units in the same building, the same property manager. So the map basically shows you where they are, where you would expect them to be. The tourist hotspots, packed in downtown, packed in Yorkville, packed in the beaches, and a few stragglers up in North York. But from there, we can actually look at the differentiation. How many people are those small-scale operators? How many people are renting out their house while they go on a European vacation? And how many people are doing this as their primary job? It's when eBay became really popular in the late 90s and the early 2000s. It started off as, buy my Beanie Baby. It became the storefront for large-scale commercial operators. It became the proto-Amazon. Airbnb is now a really interesting business story as the storefront for property managers who no longer have to do their own marketing. Airbnb is doing it for them. These are people who are operating 44, 45, 47 properties across Toronto. This is sort of a little glimpse of what that spreadsheet looked like. And because we have access to their listings, we can then also say, well, how are you marketing yourselves? What keywords are you using? How are you trying to attract people? And when the Pan Am Games were out here, we're actually like 300 meters away from Pan Am Road, a lot of those big operators started boosting their prices and saying, perfect spot for the Pan Am Games. Come stay here for the Pan Am Games. So if you went to Airbnb.com and typed in Pan Am Toronto, their listing shows up first, and it's about 20% more expensive than the neighbor's listing that doesn't mention the word Pan Am. And so it becomes a really interesting business story. Airbnb doesn't like us telling those stories. When we call them and say, can we have all of your listing data for Toronto? What about Vancouver? Can we have that? No? Whistler? Banff? Winnipeg? No. No. They don't like giving us data. They don't really like answering questions because they're a private tech enterprise. They're beholden to their shareholders and very little else. The other side of the data collection that we do is the stuff that you would think would be completely bomb-proof. The stuff that would be automated collection, it's collected by robots, it's disseminated by robots, there's no human getting in the way, there's no human interaction in this process. It's gotta be good. Hydrometric data. The government of Canada is really, really nerdy about water. We have a lot of water in this country. One of the biggest freshwater resources in the world, and we track it. Starting in the 1970s, the government of Canada placed buoys all over the country, about 3,000 of them, in lakes and rivers across the country, just to measure flow and water level across Canada. And every 15 minutes, they ping back home. Red River, smack downtown. Well, I'm at 5.2 meters. 15 minutes later, 5.21 meters. 15 minutes later, 5.2 meters. Don River, right down, 12.2 meters. 15-minute intervals since the 1970s. There's wonderful archival data there. So Toronto, I don't know if anyone's noticed, has had a few really, really awful storms lately. Some of those summer storms that used to blow in and blow out in the afternoon, and you were wet for a little bit, but if you went and got a coffee, you'd be fine. Now they last for like 6 hours in the evening. And a few years ago, they actually lifted a GO train off the tracks. People had to be rescued from the GO train by boat. Ever remember that one? So that's weird. So whenever that happens, I've started coming back to this website and saying, well, how high does the water get? How high off normal is that? And you can actually pull up station lists and get real-time or historical. And I always love pulling up the Don Valley because it's downtown Toronto, and it's also where the GO train was lifted off the tracks. And there was a little bit of rain overnight. So you can see exactly what it was doing in 15-minute intervals over the past week. So it's kind of fun. Until you dive into the extreme cases. Because we tried to use this data to write stories. We tried to use this data to say, what does the actual water level look like in Toronto? City Council is debating stormwater management. That is a relatively big budget item on the city. It's not a sexy budget item, but it's a lot of money to actually properly manage stormwater in this city. Because we keep running into these big storms that flash in and destroy property and flood out our roads and flood out our trains. So this is the big one from July 8th, 2013. This was the one where the Ferrari was under the underpass. This is the one where the GO train had to be rescued by boat. This is the one where I biked home from the National Post in the middle of it. That was a fun day. Still made it home an hour earlier than my TTC going colleagues. There's water around my ankles. It was like I was biking in a river down Yonge Street. It was a little bit weird. But this is what that data looks like. It's just a timestamp and a water level. It's a 2-column set, 15-minute intervals. You go down it and you're good to go. You graph it out and you have a really clear, nice little pattern. The fun thing about Toronto storms is that they come and go real quick. So this is your standard Sunday afternoon storm. This is your normal one that happens in mid-August where you see the clouds rolling in and you're like, let's just pop into a Starbucks, grab a Frappuccino, we'll wait this one out for 20 minutes. Storm rolls in, it's really windy, it's really violent, it's thunder and lightning, and it stops 20 minutes later and rolls out of town. Water level goes up real quick. This is what a flash flood looks like. And rivers empty out as rivers do. Next day, big storm clouds on the horizon. Big rain. And then a really interesting thing happened. It plateaued. And not just plateaued like down here where it's 12.8, 12.77, 12.79, 12.71, 12.73. Not plateaued like a calm day on the river where it's nice and sunny out. Plateaued like 15.133 for an hour and a half. It was millimeter precision for an hour and a half during one of the raging century rainstorms. The buoy had gone underwater. The people who installed the data collection system looked at the river, looked at the area around it, looked at historical water levels and said, yeah, it's never going to get this high. We'll just make it max out here. That should be fine. Deal with it later if it becomes unnecessary. But we don't actually know how high the water got because the data collection system that was automated to run every 15 minutes was underwater for an hour and a half during the worst rainstorm. So even the federal government's fully automated system, there's no political reason to hide this. There's no human that can screw it up. There's no undergrads that we can rely on to just have a typo somewhere. It's a fully roboticized, computerized system, and the human assumptions that went into it were wrong. And so that's what we are left to report with. And so that's one of the reasons why we are more reliant on City Council doing their own independent research projects, because they can hire proper cartographers, geographers, and hydrologists to actually go in and say, okay, I know that the data's not ideal, but they know they have the skills to actually dive into it a little bit deeper, and we can rely on them. Because this data, if we're only relying on extreme storm events, not great. It actually fails our needs. Now, any conversation about data and journalism and how we can be looking at it better would be incomplete without talking about consent. Consent has been really important for a long time, remains important, and our charming tech moguls are pushing the boundaries of consent every day. How many people in here are familiar with Snapchat? Cool. Snapchat's a smartphone service. The whole idea behind it is that you can send self-destructing messages. Go gadget style. Well, no, wait, wrong reference. Mission Impossible, that's the self-destructing one. This message will self-destruct. The whole idea is that you can send a photo, you can send a message to your friends, and then 10 seconds after they open it, it's gone forever. Well, it turns out that's not entirely true. Because destroying data is not in the interest of people who want to make money off that data. So at first it was actually true. They had security audits come in and said, yeah, they are actually deleting the data. That's actually kind of impressive. We never thought that would happen. And then we found out, well, they were keeping the metadata, the data that describes the data. They were keeping who you were sending it to. They were keeping the time between when it was sent and when it was opened. They were keeping your IP address. they're keeping just sort of the vague side details. But then they pushed it a little bit further. Oh, we're actually going to archive the photos themselves. That's a thing we're actually going to do now. Then they pushed it a little bit further, and they launched a feature called Snap Map, where they said, hey, you know what? Your phones all have GPS devices in them. What if, just hear us out here, what if we just automatically mapped all of your photos for you? Don't worry, it's fine. It's protected by your privacy controls. Only the people you want to see it will actually see it. It's totally fine. Then they said, wait, hold on a second. What if instead of just being like your friends, what if that map were public? And anyone could log in and see it at any time? Well, that's a thing that exists. Map.snapchat.com is a thing that exists. Welcome to SnapMap. And yep, there's people's photos and stuff on the public website. How quickly they went from it self-destructs after 10 seconds and it's so super private, anyone can use it, up to, yeah, this is where I live. Now, one of the fun parts about that is, you know, ostensibly it's, I'm driving down the highway, isn't the sky pretty today? Gets into, oh wait, here's a kid playing. Photos of children on the internet always weird me out. Children can't consent to their data distribution. Or the first time I looked at SnapMap, was a teenager taking a naked selfie in the mirror. On the public internet, consent matters. And in with that, their duty to consent their users to share their data, to use their services, that's a very, very interesting public policy debate. And there's a really great documentary that came out like 5-6 years ago now called Terms and Conditions May Apply, where spoiler alert, the closing piece of that documentary is them using Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook data to track him down while he's walking his dog. And they run up to him with a camera in his face and say, why are you stealing everyone's data? And he goes, no, don't film me. The irony is completely lost on him. But as long as the data collection consent is hazy from these companies, our duty as journalists gets hazy as well. What do we have the right to collect to tell stories? If I want to write a story about data collection from SnapMap, I am willing to bet, I don't know for sure, I've never met this kid, I am willing to bet that if you asked him explicitly in the bathroom that day, hey, this selfie you're taking in the mirror right now, do you want the world to see it? How about I present it to a room of 60-some people at a university? How's that sound to you? Great? You comfortable with that idea? I'm willing to bet he's not. But it's part of the service that he signed on to, and it's just sort of part of the flow. So do I have a duty as a journalist to not collect that data? To not use it as my research? Does that violate his assumption of privacy for me to use it in a journalistic context? That's an ongoing discussion that we have to have a lot of. And alongside with that, I'm going to actually run a live demo right now, because this is what we can do. How many people in this room are on Twitter, who use Twitter as a service? Okay, it's not too bad, actually. Cool. It's always a crapshoot. Even in rooms of undergrads, some of them are like, eh. But Twitter has become particularly more popular as the President of the United States uses it to declare policy announcements. So Twitter becomes an interesting piece. I'm just going to run this quick little script right here. This is a quick little script that searches what program you use to send tweets. Doesn't gather anything else. Just what program do you use to send tweets? Takes a few minutes to run. I'm just running it on my own Twitter account there, Wolfe-Wylie. Run another account later because it's always more entertaining to do a live example. But this becomes part of the metadata, part of what people collect in the background. And it's what's public that is concerning. Because from the metadata, we can determine where you are, what device you're using, how frequently you use it, what kind of camera it has on it. And if you use your camera, it can frequently draw the GPS coordinates of where you took that photo. And individually, those data points aren't terrible. But collectively, when you build patterns, they can be a lot of fun. So this gathers about 200 tweets per page, and I gathered 100 pages of them. So it's several tweets. So I've used Twitter for iPad 21 times. I'll make that a little bit bigger. So I've used Twitter for iPad 21 times. I've used an internet service called IFT 4 times, an internet service called Buffer 3 times, TweetDeck 510 times, Twitter for iPhone 451 times, OS X once, and the Twitter web client 8 times. Now, ostensibly, this doesn't actually tell you that much. But it tells you I have an iPad, an iPhone, and I use OS X. That's 3 different Apple devices. That alone tells you something. If all you are is interested in marketing data, cool. 3 Apple devices tells you a little bit about socioeconomic status, willingness to spend on luxury goods, and it also tells you what types of programs you can market to this person. TweetDeck is a professional-grade Twitter client meant for desktop computers. The fact that I use that more than any other service indicates that I'm frequently on Twitter at work, because it's a desktop client. And let's face it, most of us don't use desktops so much when we're not at work anymore. It's all about our phones. It means that I'm doing a lot of research. I'm tracking more than one service at once. And I'm technologically savvy enough to track multiple columns of data at once. I had a student run this analysis on them once, and it also came up that he sent tweets from a brewery tracking app that tracked what beers he liked to drink. I was like, now I know something about you too, and he was like, oh. But if we take someone a little bit more interesting and a little bit more powerful than me, and plug it in, you can do some data reporting based on how our public figures are using their private devices. And this becomes an interesting debate about consent versus journalism versus public policy, because we have to look at, okay, Twitter is a public platform. They make a certain amount of data public, and especially political figures, they're using it for those purposes. But we can learn about their private lives. And where is that line? Where does our responsibility lie? If I look up a prime minister or a president, I think most people in this room would agree, cards are on the table. Gather what you need. This is a leader of a major country. So Donald Trump tweets from the iPhone 1,960 times, Media Studio 25 times, Twitter for iPad 7 times, and the Twitter web client once. The iPhone is a fun one. iPad is actually new since I last ran this. I've never seen iPad on Donald Trump's tweets before. Media Studio is Twitter's professional level advertising platform for live streaming video and promoted tweets. So that's 25 tweets that are actively promoted. These are frequently campaign materials, live streams from his rallies. Those are paid distribution tweets. The Twitter web client is really interesting too, because that means somewhere along the line, someone actually opened a browser tab, went to www.twitter.com, and started writing in on the website, which is the least secure way to do that, which means someone typed in Donald Trump's password on a public computer at some point, which is interesting in and of itself. Now, this is just what device you use. Pair that with timestamps. Which device do you use between the hours of 8 p.m. and 3 a.m.? Which device do you use between 5 a.m. and 5 p.m.? Which device do you use in prime time? Now pair that with keyword analysis. What words do you frequently use? On which device? At what times? Well, turns out you can determine which ones are written by the president himself and which ones are written by staff. Because during the campaign, and through the first 4 months of his presidency, Donald Trump also carried a Samsung Galaxy S6. He was frequently photographed with it at campaign events. He was frequently photographed during TV interviews. He had a Samsung Galaxy S6 in his hand all the time. And if you map out by hour of day which ones are iPhone tweets and which ones are Android tweets coming from that Samsung device, all of the early morning ones are Android, and all of the working day ones are iPhone. Break it down by word count. Android tweets: Hillary, crooked, bad, Bernie, win. iPhone tweets: join, America first. Trump pet 16. So you can determine, based on that, which tweets come from the president and which tweets come from campaign staff. And that allows you to make some interesting conclusions going forward about which ones are controlled messages and which ones are him at 4 in the morning going, "Arrgh!" I actually have to look up what Justin Trudeau's Twitter handle is. It's just Justin Trudeau. Far less interesting because Canadian politicians tend to be far more controlled by their staff. The messaging is far less off the cuff in Canada, which, yay, but also, eh. Run through this last little bit. So the big thing that we want to take away from data-driven journalism is that A, it's not new. We've been looking at spreadsheets, we've been looking at logs from ships, we've been looking at ways that our kids behave as a centralized list for the better part of human history. And we've been using that to tell stories. But as the technology grows, there's a few core questions that are actually new. Yeah, so Media Studio, iPhone, Periscope is interesting. That's an old technology. Twitter web client is a big one for Justin Trudeau. That means my guess is there's a staffer in the Prime Minister's office who is just logging into twitter.com, which is an interesting security alert that you probably wouldn't want in the Prime Minister's office. Twitter for Android, and then Twitter Lite, which is also a really old iPhone-based Twitter program. So as our technology for telling these data-driven stories grows, our freedom to gather more and more information grows as well. But our ethical responsibilities also grow, and we're having a lot of conversations about what we can collect, what we should collect, and what we are legally able to collect. The federal government recently criminalized, under the Copyright Act, breaking a digital lock. No one has yet defined what a digital lock is. The Harper government reformed the Copyright Act and said, you may not break a digital lock to violate copyright. In the House of Commons, people said, what's a digital lock? We'll let the court settle it out. And we're still waiting for that actual precedent-setting court case. It has not actually come through. So periodically, we take our ideas of what data we want to collect to legal, and they say, yeah, this isn't going to be that case. You got to step it down a notch. But frequently what we have to do is come up with caveats. Once we pass the ethical hurdle, okay, we're telling a data-driven story. What are we pretending to know that we don't actually know? Can we tell people what's the old quote? It's what we know, we don't know. It's what we know for sure that just ain't so that's the biggest problem. So in the ticket story, we tried to observe every single seat in the stadium. That was the stated goal of the story. Track every seat through every platform to see how tickets are sold. Well, it turns out that with a major event that's attracting a lot of attention, that's borderline impossible. Tickets move too quickly. If we scan every 30 seconds, a lot of activity happens on these websites in that 30 seconds. So with the Bruno Mars story, we were able to track about 75% of the seats. About 25% of that stadium we just never saw. We can presume that they were purchased off the primary market, or they were held back as VIP seats and friends of the band seats, but about 25% of the market we cannot account for. And that's in the story, but it's buried at the bottom in the methodology that nobody actually reads. It's not up top with, "I've been screwed!" The Halifax explosion. You can't load meter by meter accuracy data onto a phone. It's just too big. Phones are really, really powerful these days. They're not that powerful. We have to dumb it down. What actually is loaded here versus what's actually being displayed, it's more like, 200, 300 meter accuracy. It's close. It's an approximation. It's a representation. It's a perspective. But it's not the actual Halifax Harbor. Similarly, relying on archival documents. We're relying on the fact that this guy in 1918, his cartography was accurate. His illustrations were good. We're taking his word as gospel. Might be true, might not. We have no way of verifying this. We have people working in the archives. It's a best guess. This data could be flawed and we wouldn't even know it. Long-term care home data. This is a process of separating out PDFs, optical character recognition, and regular expression pattern analysis. There are several different steps at which this could go wrong. Ones could easily be converted into L's. A's could become 2's. These are things that happen. It's a representation of the data. It's a best guess at the data. It's our best job at figuring out what this data means. And it's buried in the methodology at the bottom of the story for those who care to read it. But when we're going through 18,000 reports, we spot check. We try and do our best. Errors do creep in. Private enterprise. We call and ask for the data. No. Okay, well, I guess we'll take it from you and trust that what you're telling the public on your website is also true. We'll trust your representation of your data. We'll trust your perspective on your data. Anyone ever gone to purchase something online, and by the time fees and services and taxes get added on to the end of it, and all of a sudden shipping's $45, and you're like, whoa, this $18 purchase just became $60? Well, our scrape of that data says it's an $18 purchase. Because we don't actually go through and book all these rooms. That would be an unreasonable expense on the taxpayer's dime. So we're relying on their representation of their data to be accurate. And we're relying on them not lying to the general public so that we don't lie to the general public. We take our questions back to them and we do our best. We have due process. But data itself is inherently flawed. It's a perspective. It's an idea. It's a representation. It can be a good representation. It can be a terrifying representation. Ultimately, what we want to do is use data to better represent the world around us, to get people to understand what's happening in policy, in governance, in the new corporate world of these tech moguls that are coming up, and get them to ask more pointed questions. Sidewalk Labs is currently happening on the waterfront. And they're saying, we're going to build this wonderful smart city, and it's going to use sensors, and it's going to have underground trash collecting robots, and it's going to have these traffic lights, and the cab will learn when you leave for work, and it'll pick you up at your door in this self-driving car and whisk you off in this traffic-free street to work, and it's going to be wonderful, and it's going to be built by Google. And you say, oh. So you're going to track me when I leave for work in the morning, when I come home, the route I take. You're going to track what coffee I eat, what I put in my garbage, and you're going to track how much I recycle and how much I compost, and you're going to store it in California, and you're going to use it to send a self-driving car to pick me up. I have questions.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out that the board that was appointed by City Council to oversee these questions is currently in the process of mass resignation, because the board that's overseeing privacy and technical sovereignty and data storage, they're not being listened to. They're listening to Google. And so we have the brains in this city that are really good at data mining who are saying, this stinks and we don't like it and you're not listening to us, so we're resigning in protest. That could be a data story, but we don't have any data yet. We're hoping that doesn't turn into a data story. Ultimately, the toolbox for questioning data-driven news is the same toolbox that works in academia. What are your sources? Where did this come from? How did they get it? Did you ask for it or did you take it? Did you take it through nefarious means? Or did you take it because it was sitting on a website somewhere? Did another hacker take it? And anyone remember a few years ago when the Ashley Madison account, this is a service, a dating service for married people who wanted to cheat on their spouses. Their entire client list was leaked online. Leaked is a big red flag word. Leaked means someone with control of this data chose to post it somewhere, either as an act of protest or as an act of defiance, as a whistleblower. Leaked means I control this, and I am choosing to defy my employer by putting it over here. What happened with Ashley Madison, what happened with the PlayStation Network, what happens with Facebook and the iCloud photos that get posted of celebrities, that's a break and enter, and the distribution of stolen goods. Leaked is a giant red flag of a word. Where did this come from? Is question number one. What were their motivations in collecting it? How did they collect it? How did I get it? What questions did you ask of it? What was your hypothesis going into it? This is all academic training. Did your hypothesis turn out to be true? Did it turn out to be completely off the wall wrong? One of our hypotheses going into the Ticketmaster story was that Ticketmaster would post their own primary tickets on the resale market. Nope, can't find any evidence of that. Turned out to not be true at all. One person asked, but couldn't Ticketmaster take some of their resale tickets and post it back on the primary market? Nope, didn't find any evidence of that either. A lot of the questions we do is myth busting. Your conspiracy theories just don't bear weight. So are there hypotheses that you can test? Do they come out true or false? And the biggest thing is the visualizations that come out. Data visualizations are very, very popular. They look very, very nice. And they frequently are very, very bad. Because they don't get at any of the nuance. I can show you this graph, and I did earlier, and say this is all of the seats that were available for the Leafs' first playoff home game in 8 years. These are the ones that were available to the general public. And you're all meant to go, ooh, that's not a lot of seats. But what I always demand of my students is whenever we talk about a number, we always have to say, is that a big number or a small number? $1 million sounds like a lot of money until you're telling me that's what it costs to build a highway. We have 279 seats available for sale to the general public in an arena of 18,000. Sounds like a tiny number. Or is that 17,000 hardcore dedicated fans who stood by a team through the losing years and are now coming back to stand by them during the winning time? Is it a positive story or a negative story? Die-hard fan base or crooked sellers? Ultimately, these are pieces that are coming together in CBC policy on how we collect, how aggressive we are in our data collection, They're pieces that are coming together in our journalistic standards and practices, how we give companies notice of what we're going to publish. We gave Ticketmaster 3 weeks heads up that these stories were coming out. All the conclusions were laid out to them and said, this is what we are going to report to the general public. You have 3 weeks notice to refute any of it, to come back with us and say, we screwed up, to come back and say, that's wrong. They waited until the day we published and then publicly said, you're all wrong! And ultimately, as we start talking about fake news, as we start talking about the new world of propaganda on Facebook that's tied to these social networks, we have to come back to trusting media organizations that do this work. There are media organizations that do this work badly or not at all, and there are media organizations that do this work and take it seriously. In Canada, we are blessed with a large number of media organizations that do this well. Discourse Media in BC is a fledgling national startup that's doing a lot of really great data work. The Globe and Mail has won a Michener Award for their investigation into unfounded rape allegations. The CBC's hired dedicated staff to do this work. We have a team of data journalists now that work on investigative projects. There's a new Toronto startup called The Logic, which is actually dedicating itself right now to looking at this Google project on the waterfront and trying to figure out what questions need to be asked and asking them. There are a lot of really smart people who are doing this kind of work, and if we trust the process, we have to base that trust on something. And just as I mentioned earlier that governments tend to be reticent to be transparent about their own work, media organizations are horrifyingly bad at being transparent about their own work. But we're getting better. And this transparency about our work, I think, is the core to gaining that trust, to showing that the CBC's data work comes with caveats, as all data work does, but our perspective is well researched. We give people the chance to reply. We try and match that data against other data. We try and ask the hard questions, and we try and tell you what is going on behind the scenes so that you can make your own call. Ultimately, it's not easier than it was. There's more of it out there. There's more people trying to gain our attention. But there are tools out there. And you, in this room, are blessed with your academic training that you know how to read a report critically. And you can also help other people to learn that as well. Thanks.
Discussion and questions, but there are washrooms across the hall. There's some refreshments left at the back, so people should feel free to move as they need to as we ask William if he's willing to take some questions. I'll ask you to repeat what people say because now that you're mic, that's probably the easiest way.
Sure.
Thank you. So questions or comments?
Yeah, right here.
What about the government reaction to this data? Because I know that repeated articles on a newspaper or on the CBC can influence policies.
Yeah, and sometimes they are, sorry, what about the government reaction to all these stories? Does repeated articles influence policy, and there's examples of that? After the Globe and Mail published their Unfounded series, which, if anyone's unfamiliar, this is Robin Doolittle's work. They did a wonderful series that found that police dismiss up to 20% of sexual assault claims as completely unfounded and they never investigate them. That resulted in inquiries in more than half of Canadian police departments. And hundreds of new cases were properly investigated, and in some cases, charges were laid against the assailants. This was a large data project that involved filing Freedom of Information requests with every single police department in the country, and frequently getting PDFs back, spreadsheets back, and trying to make sense of it and bringing all that data into a central resource. It took the better part of 2 years for a team of 5 people to bring this story to light. When the government saw this, it was in question period the very next day. The RCMP launched a review within a month, and smaller police departments took about 6 months to really get on board, but real change has been affected by this journalism. Frequently, you'll see stories where it's less easy for the government to react. There's not a clear villain in the story. So examples like we do audits of how the freedom of information system works in Canada. And governments have been promising as their campaign pledges for 6, 7, 8 elections now to revamp the freedom of information system in Canada. And these audits keep coming out and showing that delays keep happening, no data is actually released, no one's actually answering questions, government transparency is at a 50-year low. Yeah, nothing really comes of that. So that's where we rely on the journalism to get people asking their MPs about what they value. And if this story resonates with individual people, I spoke with an MP once, and they told me that the total number of letters that they need to get about any given issue before they start to think that it's a real thing that the average Canadian cares about and they should start thinking more strongly about, it's 2. They get so little mail that if 2 people email them about the same thing, they say, oh wait, this might actually be a thing we should pay attention to. So if you're one of those people, you actually do have voice in government. How about that? Yes?
You've shown us there's a huge amount of data being collected.
Yes.
What about the other end? There's a limit to broadcast time. There's a limit to print time. But there appears to be no real limit to the mix of the internet, the web, and social media. So what happens to all this data, and who decides what gets published?
I was really, really hoping someone would ask that question. Question is, you've seen a lot of data that gets collected for journalism. What about data that's disseminated on the other side? You have limited amount of space in newspapers and broadcast time. So I've collected 1 million rows of Ticketmaster data. What happens to that? And that's actually currently a point of policy debate at the CBC on whether we have a, by default and by rule, a download the data associated with this research right here. Very frequently we do that. We throw it to the website and say, all the data associated with this journalism is available here, download the link. Not always the case. For instance, the Ticketmaster data is not publicly downloadable right now because it's so big, actually. It's about 1 gigabyte of text at this point in time. And so we are making it available to individual researchers at academic institutions who want to use it. I've been approached by professors at McGill and at Laurier who want to use it for big data classes in physics and mathematics modeling. And we are happy to provide it to them to use as teaching tools as they see fit. But for the general public, it's a point that's still actively being discussed. And I want to disseminate more of it. It's just a question of how much of it there is and the best way to allow people. One of the points of debate right now is, do we just allow you to download an Excel file? And is that good enough? Or do we have a bare responsibility to create a portal where you can explore it, filter it, map it? Is that good enough? What is the expectation of the general public? What is our responsibility to them to convey this information? So that's a point of research, it's a point of debate, and I'm part of that debate, so if you have perspective on that, I'd love to hear it. Yes?
Some data we get exposed to all the time is the results of polls of the public. So this could be on various policies, could be who you're going to vote for. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're incredibly wrong. I wonder, can you say anything about how to interpret polls that come out on CBC News?
So the question is polling data, especially around political polling. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's desperately, desperately not. And how we report polling data. So one of the big things that we did this year, actually it was last year, Eric Grenier, who's one of our parliamentary reporters, he's a pollster by training, and this is part of the science that he works with. We decided that instead of commissioning our own polls, there's enough of them being done, so we just started amalgamating all of them and weighting them according to their methodologies. So this is not something that I'm particularly trained in, so I can't quite speak to the science, but sweet, the Wi-Fi is not loading this one right now. Refreshing results, that's always a good thing to see. But what we did, oh, this is 2015, that's probably why. There we go, a little bit better. So what Eric did is he started gathering all the poll data from all the different pollsters and bringing it together into one space so that he could actually amalgamate it and try and gather a grain of truth out of it. If you say John Tory's got a 60% chance of winning and the other pollsters say it's more like a 45% chance of winning, the truth, as we all know, is probably somewhere in between. But if you gather enough polling data from enough different methodologies and enough different sample sizes, you can probably find that space in between. And so that's what Eric Grenier has been trying to do instead of conducting our own polls. It's a trick. With the provincial election, he was actually bang on. With the American presidential election, he was way off. So it's an imprecise science, as best I can say. Yeah.
You spoke about leaks being a huge red flag.
Yes.
So Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange, heroes or villains?
Ah.
Why?
Highly political question. So in those cases, the word leak is accurate because they did have access to that information. They were in control of that information, and they chose to disseminate it as whistleblowers. I tend to lean more towards radical transparency over secrecy as a personal point of lean. So I tend to lean more towards hero than villain. On the other hand, as a point of dissemination, I do think that you have a responsibility to protect people who might be harmed by the release of this information. So working with journalists to identify the stories that come from this while protecting potential victims. And so in the case of Chelsea Manning, the one big one was harm's way. Are we keeping soldiers from harm's way? By distributing these secrets, these videos, are we protecting people? And well, a video of a Black Hawk helicopter using its cannon to blow away a journalist with a camera, I think that shows a military tactic. I think it shows operations of soldiers on the ground that is clarifying what war on the ground looks like and is therefore a public good. Julian Assange tends to lean more towards in the other way, where he tends to publish anything, regardless of what it might do in the future, as an act of very radical transparency. And there are more cases, I think, there where people might be hurt. It is a red flag word, though, because ultimately people have to make that call. Does this risk hurting people? And ultimately, journalists, much like medical professionals, do have a duty, I think, to do no harm. And our job is to try and help rather than hinder. Yes?
In nursing homes now, I find they're asking so many of the PSWs and people who work in the program for statistics. And they have to, I know when my mother was in a nursing home, they had a screen and they had to put all these relevant statistics pertaining to each resident. If they have time to accurately put that much into the machine, it's to the detriment, I'm sure, of the care that the actual person with care they need. Because they are understaffed to start with.
That's one of the biggest things that our reporters found when they visited these care homes, is every single one of them said, we're understaffed. This would be such a better situation if we had the staff to properly deliver care. We know where the holes are. You ask us where the holes are, we'll tell you where the holes are. There's no permission to hire new people. It's becoming an interesting thing. That becomes a common refrain across any number of industries now, from our hospitals to our long-term care homes to construction crews. You wonder why the roads are falling apart, is people keep saying we don't have the staff. There's hiring freezes. First thing the new provincial government did is put in a hiring freeze. So I have a buddy of mine actually who was at the Ontario Science Centre. He's building an exhibit for kids to understand the mission to Mars. But he's a contractor. Hiring freeze came in. That exhibit's not being built anymore. This side now, yeah.
Hypocrisy and wanting to look better than you really are has been with us since the beginning of time. And already in the Ten Commandments, we're told not to bear false witness. And Jesus denounced hypocritical religious leaders in his time. Are there ways in which our ethics can be improved so that people inwardly seek to be less hypocritical and not to try to hide sexual assault claims, and not to try to give false information about nursing homes and so on. Is there some ethical movement that you would like people to do to make things better?
An ethical movement to make things better. Would that I could spearhead such a thing. I tend to fall into the camp of personal action speaks loudest of all. I do speeches like this. I volunteer time at Ladies Learning Code. I teach kids about technology and the responsible use of their smartphones. I think spending a lot of time in educational spaces is one of the best things I can do to try and spearhead that ethical movement. My second-year philosophy professor would tell me that I am not the right person to be talking about ethics. That was a solid D+ in that course right there, but sorry.
You seem to be an expert at knowing how to track things on the internet, and I'm just wondering if you take certain steps yourself to avoid being tracked. I know you've been using DuckDuckGo.
Yes.
Any advice you give people?
So the question is how I personally avoid being tracked, and what advice I offer to people on the preliminary end of personal protection on the internet. First is to realize, so I'm going to summarize, I have roughly a 2-hour seminar that I give on this particular topic for student journalists, because tracking, especially by police organizations and law enforcement in Canada and the United States, is a real and ongoing threat to journalists. So the first step is to realize that everything you do can be tracked. And where there is financial motivation to track, there will be tracking. So if you're on the extreme end, leave your phone at home if you're going anywhere that's sensitive. Meeting a confidential source, receiving a leaked file, meeting someone in a dark parking garage. Do not bring electronic devices with you. They are tracking devices. This is a giant walking homing beacon. On the more consumer end of things, most services have a privacy policy or a declared statement of what they value. So I use Firefox. It's run by the Mozilla Foundation. It is a not-for-profit organization. Their goal is to provide private and secure communications on the web. They don't track me as I move through the web. Google Chrome, their stated goal is to make money off of advertising. They track you as you move across the web. The latest version of Chrome actually got in trouble because as soon as you signed into Chrome, it signed you into all of your Google services within that browser and attached all of your browsing history, regardless of whether you had Gmail open, to your master Google account. People pushed back against that and said, no, that's not okay. And they said, oh, sorry, it was our bad. We didn't mean to. I give it 6 more months before they do it again. DuckDuckGo is a search engine. It doesn't personalize search results. It doesn't track what you have previously searched. It doesn't personalize the ads that go against you. It delivers the same search results to everybody, which means it's less accurate as a search engine. I frequently have to search more explicitly because the stuff I want doesn't necessarily come up first. Google is very, very good at giving me what I want first. But by going to DuckDuckGo, I don't give that information to Google. And that's a personal choice I make. So my ads are less relevant, but I'm also not being tracked. I use ad blocker. This is a program called uBlock Origin. I've blocked 131,151 trackers in the past year. These are programs that may or may not be looking for me and where I go. They may be trying to place ads. They may have something more nefarious in mind. There's a plugin called HTTPS Everywhere that automatically encrypts all my internet traffic wherever it can. There's a program called Mailvelope, which automatically encrypts email communications. There are a few extensions. Firefox Lightbeam is a program that automatically tracks your trackers. So when you do have trackers on your machine, it tells you who they are, what they're looking for, and who they're reporting back to. So you can actually see that when you go to theglobeandmail.com, they're sharing advertising information with the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and Google and Facebook. And all of that information gets sent back to one master database with everything that you like to look at on the internet. Facebook container limits Facebook, so even if I'm logged into Facebook, Facebook can't see what I'm doing on the rest of the internet. Facebook thinks I'm logged out when I'm browsing elsewhere. Otherwise, everywhere there's a Facebook like button, Facebook knows you're there. Ultimately, I become a little bit OCD about not being tracked, but the best part about it is when I get ads for political campaigns happening in Arizona, because that's how little they know about me. Yeah, right here.
I'm a boring person in terms of the internet. I'm not a very sophisticated user. I tend to use the same kinds of sites regularly. You know, if I'm going to Google Chrome something, it may be, you know, what's the mark on my nose?
Yep.
Kind of thing. Do I care? Do I care if these people want to look at my data?
So the interesting part is, does your network care? Are you, so there's a couple different ways to look at it. One is, do I care? In which case, do you care if the ads know that you have a mark on your nose? Do you care if you might get skin cancer ads, or that you might be flagged as a health risk next time someone pulls your advertising information and applies it to your insurance premiums? They're now attaching sensors like, okay, how many times do you activate driving mode on your phone? How many times do you deactivate driving mode when your GPS is still going like this? Is that an indicator that you're driving with your phone? Maybe we should hike your auto insurance rates. Insurance companies are now saying, if you plug this device into your car, we might give you a break on your insurance if you're a good driver. Well, now, what counts as a good driver? How quickly you accelerate or decelerate? Maybe it's how frequently you adjust the radio while you're driving over a certain limit. The methodologies aren't there, but they're going to reward you for it. So to me, it comes down to active and informed consent. What are we signing up for? And what are they asking in return? And what am I actually giving up? If the answer is, I'm not actually sure, then that to me is a warning sign. And that's not a piece that I'm willing to consent to right now. If Google's going to track when I leave for work in the morning and have a car ready for me when I get there, maybe that's a fine thing. Or maybe they then say, oh wait, you weren't there that one morning. Was that a sick day? You did Amazon Prime some cough drops, and then you went online and looked up, is this hacky cough really dangerous? And then you did take a self-driving car the next day, but it was to a doctor's office. Oh, then you came home and Googled Cancer Care Ontario support group. Oh, and then you took and all of a sudden it's not an individual data point that matters, but the collection of data points and what large companies that want to monetize that information will do with it later. Active and informed consent. I need to know what your intention is, and then I can make a call on whether I want to give it to you. If you're not going to tell me what you're going to do with it is, I'm not going to give you my consent. Yeah.
Did you see any data on the amount of time and cost involved with individuals being on either their social media or text in the workplace?
Data about the amount of time people spend on social media in the workplace.
On private matters.
Yes. Data on how much time people waste at work on social media and related activities. What I'm really interested in is if the overall decline in smoking rates matches a relative rise in social media use. People used to take a smoke break outside. Very few people do that anymore. Are they spending the same amount of time on Facebook? Basically, I've not seen the data. There's some survey data, there's some individual data. Basically, every time there's a company that says, we want to track how often our employees are at their desks and what they're doing on their computer monitors, there's usually a union uprising against that kind of intrusive monitoring. So it hasn't really happened yet in data that's been made public that I've seen. But I'd be very interested to see if there's an actual change in amount of time wasted or just what we're doing to waste it. Sorry, right in the back there.
A few years ago, I was involved with CCAC because I had a project there. And a
What
very
is
large project-
CCIA? We don't know what,
very expensive.
what is that?
And then the frontline workers, who
So the question is ultimately, are we too concerned about the data and the data collection and the data analysis at the expense of actually delivering services, actually delivering healthcare, actually repairing roads? It could be. My obsession with data is usually with holding these organizations to account and telling people what they're doing with our time and money. The government association with data, I don't know. My brother-in-law used to work for Economic Development Ontario, and he would periodically tease me with spreadsheets that he was looking at about the impact of green energy programs or such things. I think ultimately there is a bigger strive towards more analytics, more data, more spreadsheets, more data-driven decision making. Overall, I think if you overinvest in data and underinvest in care, you're making the wrong choice, because then you just become hyper aware of how little care you're delivering. If you're doing it properly, you can become hyper aware about how much care you're delivering and where best to allocate resources to deliver better care and more care. Right now, I think we're at the early stages of being able to make that call. We know exactly how little care we're delivering and where. But at the risk of getting political, that's a game for the ballot box, because these are decisions that were in the last provincial election, and these were decisions that we got to debate in the most recent municipal election. And we have candidates who want to do different things, and that's where votes go. Yes?
I wonder if you could comment on fake news. Well, both ends of it, the actual fake news and the accusations of fake news by your adversaries. And perhaps to make it political, Trump, I believe, embodies both types of news.
So the question is if I can comment on fake news as a relatively modern term and on how that term is used by political adversaries who dislike the work of journalists.
It's actually fake news.
Yes. So the term was coined by Craig Silverman at BuzzFeed, Toronto guy, and it became a global sensation and really took off when Donald Trump started using it as an accusation. Fake news as a term was originally intended to describe for-profit services that provide inaccurate information for shock value. And then you go to that page, they get the ad click off of it, they get the ad impression off of it, and they make money. That's all it was intended to be. For-profit, private enterprise that peddles fake information, made up stories. It became a political weapon to point at anything that someone dislikes. People are pointing at the weather report now and saying, fake news! And as such, it's become a term that just means, I dislike what you're saying. Not even, I disagree with what you're saying, or I have issues with the methodology of what you're saying, or I think your source may have misspoken, but I dislike what you're saying. And I think calling something fake because we dislike it is a very, very problematic road. We can dislike as much as we want. We can have informed discussion about any policy point. We can debate where government should go, where it should spend money. We can debate how people comport themselves in public. We can debate a lot of things. But if any debate is just shut down by saying, fake! It doesn't help anybody. It's not progressing anything at all. I hate the term. I didn't mention it in this talk because I can't stand the term. It started off as for-profit propaganda by private enterprise, and it became something wholly different. Yes?
I noticed you have the baby wife.
Oh, yes.
And I was just wondering if you can comment on, maybe not that clearly broadly, but clearly baby videos and children in general.
So my child will never have their face on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Their face will never be on the internet. Because Facebook's stated goal is to map the world social networks, regardless of whether you have a Facebook account or not. They are creating ghost profiles for when their facial recognition pieces see a person in a photo, and they try and match it with a Facebook profile. If they can't match it with an existing Facebook profile, they create one for it. And they start tracking where else they see that face. who else that face is hanging out with, what their networks look like. And regardless of whether that person has consented to Facebook's process, they're now part of it. And that's not a thing I'm willing to let my child be a part of right now. So the baby Wiley cam is, I was doing a lot of reading into security analysis of baby monitors, and all baby monitors now come with cameras and infrared cameras and temperature control sensors and speakers and microphones, and they're very $400 devices now. And a lot of them are broadcasting over the internet in unencrypted signals, which means that if you know where to look, you can go look at any of them. And periodically there are stories of daycares that have these set up so that parents can see their kids at daycare. Elementary schools that have these set up for security cameras. And unbeknownst to these daycare operators and school operators, they're broadcasting the pictures of children over the open internet for anyone to see. And the more and more research I did, the more and more distrusting I became of the whole thing, because at heart I am a conspiracy theorist, and was convinced that there's going to be something horrifyingly bad if I buy the Motorola Exit whatever. So I built my own. I bought the circuit board, I bought the camera, I bought the infrared light. I coded my own to actually just limit it to my network so I could have a little baby camera that could mount to the side of my crib and would just be my own little thing that I controlled, at least that part of the world. And I built it to be accessible over my home network via a web browser, so I could pull it up on my phone, I could pull it up on my laptop and see how the little kid is doing. Because I'm paranoid. Yes?
Same lines, we're watching children. You know, a lot of the schools now will take a snapshot of what the child is doing in school and send it to the parents in private connection that they have with the school, the emails that they share. So is there a danger in that?
Yeah, and that's the thing that's up to every individual's personal preference level. Like, what device are they shooting that photo on? Is it an iPad? Is it an Android phone? Is it a really old Android phone with no security patches? Is it a little Nikon point and shoot? How are they deleting the photos after they take them? Are they sending them over an email connection, or are they sending them via a social media network? Ultimately, anytime a child is photographed, parents have to sign a consent form. And so I won't sign that consent form because I'm paranoid as anything. But those are questions that I would have to ask. And some daycares are really, really up on that kind of thing. Other daycares just have a no photos policy, and cameras don't enter the area. But it is a thing that more and more institutions are grappling with, is how to handle child privacy. Yes?
My thoughts. Your entire talk is on data, and the work that you do is on data. Do you sense in your work that there's more and more public trust in stories that came from data? Meaning that you can say whatever you want, but if you don't have data to prove it is substantiated, then I feel a little bit skeptical about your story or the claims that you're trying to make. My question is do you see a countercurrent where this kind of more pervasive public trust in data is used in the counter sense of misleading? You know what I mean? So
Yeah. So the question is, like, data can...
as being massaged and adjusted in a particular way to advance an agenda.
Yeah. So the question basically amounts to, can data make something more credible, but in the hands of the wrong person also make it less credible at the same time? And I think humans are hardwired to take numbers as something that's a little bit more factual than an opinion. I tell you I had 3 glasses of wine yesterday. That's a lie. I did not. But attaching a number to it makes it sound a little bit more plausible than without a number. People are naturally inclined, I think, to take it that way. But I think we also see enough data stories that comes out with, like, 67% of Canadians think that we should have no immigration at all in Canada. And I think most news readers would look at that stat and go, really? 67%? None at all? That seems maybe like an exaggeration. I do think people should be better at filtering all news stories through their own bias system and through their own skeptical brain to try and figure out what rings true and what doesn't. But yeah, I think the addition of numbers can be used in either way.
So this is an interesting point for us. In this room here, we're people that have gone through a different time in history and have an appreciation for what things are like. And I like to think that we may be a little bit more critical in what we see and be a little bit more skeptical. If you hear a story, you say, really? And you try and check with other sources. So, but we're moving on, and the next generation is coming along, where they're taking data and information electronically, verbatim, because they didn't have time, so if enough friends like it, then I guess it must be true. So, in the macro sense, I'm wondering if you observe that there's a potential, I guess, threat coming for us as humans to say, do we then lose the opportunity or the time to develop these critical thinking, to be more inquisitive about what we see and hear, and not just sipping things verbatim. And
So,
you can see that now with even the media, in terms of people tend to go to the channel that speaks to their mind and ignore the other ones. We maybe, some of us maybe say, well, this is what they say. Then we check it with the BBC or with Fox News and see what they say and then make your own judgment. But I'm wondering if that kind of instinct is diminishing.
So overall, should we be inquisitive and critical of data-driven stories, but also of news media in general? And has the rise in this availability and the rise of the internet and the rise of technology overall made us less inquisitive over time and more at risk of taking things at face value? Yeah, and I think overall, no. The idea that news media is more partisan now than it ever has been, it is on a swing in that direction, but at the early bit of the 20th century, news media was operated by candidates for public office. This story that I started off this presentation with was actually written by a candidate for the United States Congress. News media as a middle ground arbiter of objective truth is a blip in the history of the printed word. It really, really started in the 1920s and 30s as news media for the first time became very, very profitable. And then all with high profit margins, you had the freedom of ideals. And the objective media really took off in the 50s and 60s and 70s before it started to fall off in the 80s, even in the pre-internet era. By the time you get through the 90s and all of a sudden those profit margins start to sink, people start to lose their ideals real quick as media owners. By the time you get into the 2000s, we have the division between MSNBC and Fox News. You get the Toronto Sun and you get the CBC as bastions of conservatism and liberalism. And that's not a new story. Nor is it a new story that young people aren't particularly well equipped to make those differentiations and to question what they see at face value. That has been true of our educational process for a really long time. It's why we rely on older generations to instruct young people on the best way to read things and to read critically. My first day at university, the university president at Mount Allison stood up and said, what you learn here is less important than that you learn to learn. And that was the #1 goal of that university as an undergraduate program. And that, I think, is our goal here as either media workers or academic workers, is to help young people to get to that point where they can see, wait, you're using extravagant language, you're using uncited sources, you're throwing numbers out there without telling me where they came from. I'm questioning this. And I see the difference when I'm instructing kids who have just come out of high school and they're 19, 20 years old, and even just a couple years later when I instruct kids in a post-grad program. The difference in their ability to read critically is astronomically different. And that's the sign of everyone in this room doing their jobs really well, that kids are now growing that skill. And they're able to do so with more reliance on technology and more reliance on data and better literacy of those subjects.
I think we better stop there, although this could go on forever, really. I mean, it's fascinating.
It really could.
It really could. Please join me in thanking William for a fantastic